everything.
It's everything.
Welcome to or welcome back to the Emajae Talks Everything podcast, where I talk politics, pop culture, and everything in between. I am Emajae, and we are on episode 4 of this podcast. Like we are moving, okay? So if you haven't already liked this video, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, then you need to go ahead and do that, okay? By the end of this video, I'm gonna need to see the likes, I'm gonna need to see the comments, I'm gonna need to see all of it, okay? All the good stuff. And also, if you haven't caught up on my previous videos, then I need you to go run those up as well, because every single week I am here like clockwork, okay, talking, getting into it, and yeah, I be having a lot to say. I just be having a lot to say, a lot on my mind, a lot that's going on in the world, which we're definitely going to be talking about today. So just make sure, if you haven't already, go back, watch my previous videos, like this one, subscribe, comment, do all of the things, okay? Let's see. Let's just kind of get into, well, actually first, before we get into it, hello, it's Pride Month. Happy Pride. Shout out to all those who celebrate, which should be everyone, honestly. Like, hello, whether you're an ally, whatever. Happy Pride. Also, it is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. So shout out to the men and shout out to recognizing the importance of mental health, particularly when it comes to men. I think that's super important to shout out. And yeah, how are y'all feeling? That's really the question. How are y'all feeling? Because I know that this week for me has been exhausting. It's truly been exhausting. It's really just been one of those weeks where it's like you have your own life, but then the state of the world is also happening, and it's just so hard sometimes to move and operate on a day-to-day basis when it's like you see the world just up in flames, it feels like. So we're gonna get into that and we're gonna talk more about that. That's really the premise of the video. Like, a lot has been happening across the country as it relates to the protests that have been occurring, specifically in Los Angeles, but across the country now. And I really want to get into my thoughts and feelings about that. So, but before I do, I have to say, so let me go ahead and introduce. We are getting into everything in the news. Welcome. This is a part of my show where I talk about the things that are happening in the news. But before I get too deep into that, right? I just have to say that this past weekend, I watched Straw. Now, for those of you who do not know, Straw is one of Tyler Perry's new movies. It stars Taraji P. Henson and several other actresses who you might be familiar with: Sherry Shepherd, Tiana Taylor. Okay, so if you watched episode 2 of the Emajae Talks Everything podcast, then you know that I had to take a few minutes. I'm gonna be honest, it was a few minutes. It wasn't just a few seconds, but I took a few minutes and I challenged Tyler Perry to do better, because I was talking about the show Forever, which is an amazing show that you should watch. But I was talking about Forever and how it was just so nuanced and it provided so much depth to Black stories. And I used that moment to talk about how Tyler Perry just doesn't do it. So this past weekend, I go home with my family, and let me tell you, when I tell you my family, they will watch a Tyler Perry movie, okay? Like, one thing about it, they're gonna watch a Tyler Perry movie. And so, you know, when in Rome, do as the Romans. And so I was at home, they wanted to watch Tyler Perry, Straw, and so that's what we did. If I'm gonna be fair, okay, and this is not a full-blown review because I just don't care that deeply, but if I'm gonna be honest, I'll say that it wasn't his worst work. Like, it wasn't the worst that Tyler Perry has ever done, okay? It wasn't, I'll be honest. But it was the same recipe. It was insert Black woman insert the worst trauma that you can conjure up, the worst pain that you can imagine, insert bad wig, and you have a Tyler Perry movie. I mean, it was his same old 1 + 1 + 1 = 3 formula. And again, it wasn't the worst, it wasn't the best, it was straw. Now, what I will say, and what I do want to give brief commentary on is, like I said in my previous video when I was talking about Tyler Perry, it's always this argument of, at least there's Black stories that are being told. And I saw a few interviews where the cast of Straw, specifically, I believe it was Sherry Shepherd, and I'm pretty sure I saw an interview with Taraji P. Henson, where they were like, give this man his credit. Give this man his just due because he's paying us and we're not getting paid. Listen, I'm here for Black women getting paid. I'm here for anyone getting paid what they are entitled to get paid, especially when they're doing the same work as someone else. And, you know, you're just not seeing equal compensation across the board. So shout out to Tyler Perry for paying Taraji and Sherry Shepherd and all of his actors and actresses what they are entitled to be paid. However, it doesn't negate other people's arguments, which is the quality of these movies are just sometimes not there. And I just wish that when these actresses, Taraji, Sherry, when you guys would go out on these interviews and you would big up Tyler, I get it because this is the man that's paying you. But at the same time, like, let's also acknowledge that people have a point, right? People have a point. And he's a billionaire. He should be paying you. Like, what are we even talking about? He should be paying you what you deserve. He is literally a billionaire. And the reason he can afford to pay you, the reason why he can afford to pay you what you're getting paid is because productions that should probably be taking months, he is making happen in literally minutes, like days at a time. I think Taraji said that they shot Straw in 4 days. So he's cutting costs and we see it. The audience, we see it, we feel it, we get it, okay? So great, you're getting paid what you are supposed to get paid, but just because your individual experience is one thing, it doesn't negate the overall impact of Tyler Perry's work, which is once again centering Black women, but not centering their joy, not centering the nuance and the complexities of what it is to be a Black woman. Instead, it's usually centered around pain and struggle. And I just refuse to believe that those are the only stories that billionaire Tyler Perry can tell. But I'm gonna move on from Tyler Perry because I have already talked about him more than I intended to. And I really wanna get into what's been happening with the ICE raids, the protests. That has really been kind of top of my mind. And so even though this is what's in the news, everything that's in the news, you'll see that I'm going to transition this topic into everything that's on my mind, because at the same time, that's just how life works. A lot of the times it's the things that are in the news that I just sit with and really am processing and thinking about. And so that's what this platform is about. It's really me processing my thoughts and my opinions, and perhaps you're listening and perhaps you care, perhaps you're watching and care, and perhaps not, but that is what this platform is. So let me just go ahead and get into it. Trump. Okay, so where did this start? This basically started, I mean, it's no surprise. I mean, anyone who's been keeping up with the politics of Trump knows that even as early as when he was campaigning, the way he talked about immigration, the way he talked about immigrants, we saw it coming that Trump was going to really prioritize cracking down on immigration, right? Key, not immigration reform, not reforming the system, not, making the system more efficient for immigrants, but just cracking down on immigrants, whatever that means. And so as soon as he got into office, he, had all of these executive orders that he made, and they did different things, right? There were many different executive orders that Trump executed as soon as he got into office. And in totality, the impact of those executive orders essentially led to ICE just ramping up, right? And what we have seen over the past few months, really, since these executive orders, is what I believe to be ICE simply being completely out of control in terms of how they are going about executing Trump's executive orders, how they are going about dealing with immigrants in our country. And I think there's so many different ways that we can really get into it, but this is a tough topic for me because I don't know if I want to go morally, if I want to go ethically. I don't know if I want to go legally, but what I will do is I'll start with the legal side of things, because I don't want someone to watch this video or listen to this video on the many streaming platforms, mind you. I don't want someone to watch or listen to this video and think that my opinion is strictly based on my emotions, because I'm going to be honest, I do feel so many emotions tied to what is happening. I was born in this country. I am not myself an immigrant. However, how can you not feel for people living in fear that someone is going to walk into their house without any, pre-warning or anything and sweep them up, take them into a detention center that is who knows where, possibly never seeing their family again. And that is exactly what is occurring. That is exactly what's happening. And even with all of those emotions, I'm going to start from the legal aspect of this because that's just undeniable. And what's really undeniable about this is the fact that these ICE raids, a lot of these ICE raids are simply unconstitutional, okay? There is something called due process. Now, due process, in short, really just means that you are entitled to an opportunity to be heard. You are entitled to notice, right? Notice and an opportunity to be heard equals due process. Why is that important? It's important because what we're seeing is ICE is just showing up at people's graduations, at their homes, at their schools. These are people who, are usually awaiting their hearings for their immigration process, and they are not getting to the court, or perhaps they are making it to the court and ICE is waiting for them right there at the courthouse to take them away before they're even getting their opportunity to be heard in court. And what I want people to understand about due process in relation to what's happening with the immigration situation is the Constitution does not say that you are afforded due process if you are a legal citizen. That's actually not what the Constitution protection affords. The Constitution protects any person, whether you are a legal citizen, whether you are not a legal citizen, you are entitled to due process. And I want to pull up the receipts directly from the Constitution because, again, I'm going to give my personal thoughts and opinions and feelings about what's happening, but it's also important that people understand that these feelings are based off of facts. So let's get into what the Constitution says about due process. And this is straight from the Constitution annotated. And I think it's just, again, important to pull up the receipts straight from where they are. The Fifth Amendment provides that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Generally, due process guarantees due process guarantees protect individual rights by limiting the exercise of government power. The Supreme Court has held that the Fifth Amendment, which applies to federal government action, provides persons with both procedural and substantive due process guarantees. If the federal government seeks to deprive a person of a protected life, liberty, or property interest, the Fifth Amendment's due process clause requires that the government first provide certain procedural protections. Procedural due process often requires the government to provide a person with notice and an opportunity for a hearing before such a deprivation. In addition, the Supreme Court has interpreted the Fifth Amendment's due process clause to include substantive due process guarantees that protect certain fundamental constitutional rights from federal government interference, regardless of the procedures that the government follows when enforcing the law. Substantive due process has generally dealt with specific subject areas like liberty of contract, marriage, privacy. So what does that mean? The most important thing here is, again, Fifth Amendment Constitution says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That has been interpreted to mean that you are entitled to procedural due process, meaning that you are entitled to notice that someone is about to snatch something away from you and an opportunity to be heard before something is snatched away from you. And substantive due process, which really just means that they need to give a compelling reason for why they have chosen to snatch this particular thing away from you, right? And when you have ICE agents showing up in people's homes, in people's houses, what do you think is going to happen? People are going to live in fear. People are going to take it to the streets. They're going to take it to the streets because the government is violating the Constitution. And when people feel like they don't have legal avenues to address harm that is being done to them, they take it to the streets. Protest is one of the oldest forms of relaying to the government that there is a problem here. And that's exactly what was happening in LA. So getting to the protests, right? And mind you, ICE agents were also literally detaining people who were actual citizens. That's another thing. And that's part of the issue with a lot of these executive orders and a lot of the thought process behind, what's happening is there's really no rhyme or reason behind a lot of what these ICE agents are out here doing. I mean, your job has nothing to do with detaining actual citizens of the United States. So what basis are you going off of if that's still happening? Make that make sense. So anyway, Friday, July 6th, protests break out because ICE agents ended up going to Los Angeles. And I have a timeline here. I'm not going to go through the entire timeline, but ICE agents ended up going to Los Angeles. They, were raiding multiple locations. One particular location that has been, one of the more prominent ones we've heard about in the news is a Home Depot that they raided. And essentially that happened, say, Friday morning. And then later that afternoon, that's when protests began. Demonstrators gathered outside of, the federal detention centers. And by 7:00 on Friday evening, the LAPD declared unlawful assembly in the area. They started deploying tear gas and things of that nature. The police force declared a citywide tactical alert. I mean, it was isolated, peaceful protest. And what we saw really is that law enforcement immediately began to get involved. But at this point, it was local law enforcement, right? LAPD. So it's still at this point at the state level. Governor Newsom even said that the protests were to be maintained, that the state had it. They were handling it. It was not protests across the entire city, really. It was isolated protests that were happening in response to these unconstitutional ICE raids. Okay, that's what was happening. And let's see, the timeline says that next morning, or not even that next morning, but at some point in the next day, the Trump administration announced that it will deploy the National Guard, claiming the limited protests were a rebellion against the U.S. government. The California governor, Gavin Newsom, immediately denounces the move, the first time a U.S. president has mobilized U.S. military forces in a domestic political situation without the request of the state's governor since 1965. Now listen, I'm not a mathematician, but let's do the math. Since 1965, that's 75, 85, 95, 05, 50, that's 60, it's been 60 years since a president has deployed or mobilized U.S. military forces against its own citizens without the request of the state governor. In 60 years. That is when I believe, and people on the ground, accounts from people on the ground have stated that that's when, you know what, really started to hit the fan, right? Because when you have a situation where you are peacefully protesting against violent behavior, which let's be very clear here, showing up at people's homes, showing up at people's schools, at their graduations, at their intimate, personal gatherings, unannounced, taking them away in the middle. I mean, this is violent behavior. And when you have people going to the streets, peacefully protesting, and then you deploy the military forces that really are supposed to be protecting them, but you deploy these forces against them, essentially, again, what do we think is going to happen? What do we think the outcome is going to be? And let me tell you, the outcome is exactly what Trump wanted it to be. He wanted to create chaos. He wanted, and this is where it becomes my opinion, right? Because I don't know Trump personally, but it seems to me that this was an intentional strategy. Look at them out there tearing up the streets, throwing rocks at government agents, all of these different things. It feeds into this narrative that I believe the administration was already trying to perpetuate about these people, when in reality, I think that their response is one based off of fear. It's one based off of, this is truly, in a lot of different ways, a last resort, is to go to the streets. And in this country, we do have constitutional protections and constitutional rights that say that we are allowed to go to the streets. So what kind of government is it where you are met with violence for exercising your constitutional right to speak out against your other constitutional rights being violated by said government? Do y'all see how that is not okay? Do y'all see how that is problematic? My takeaways from what's happening in Los Angeles, and these protests are now spreading across the country. But my takeaways are, number one, like I said last week, question everything. Immediately, certain news channels were referring to these protests as riots. Let's be very, very clear. Protest does not inherently mean riot. There are a lot of distinct characteristics of a gathering that equates to a riot versus a gathering that equates to a protest. Okay? Another thing that I think is important, and I kind of hinted at it just a bit ago, which is, let's not negate the violence that it is where someone can just show up at your doorstep, unannounced, take you away. You might not see your family again, even though you were entitled to a warning that you might have had to go, or at least entitled to being heard on the fact that you might have to leave. But instead of any of that, they just show up at your house. That is violent behavior. That is traumatic behavior. And it's not okay, especially for a country that pushes out the propaganda that this is a melting pot, right? Land of the free. That is literally the propaganda of the United States. And so when you have people who buy into that, this is how we treat those people. This is the message that we're sending. It doesn't make sense to me. Let me make sure that I hit on everything here, because I really want to get into another part of this conversation that feels probably a little bit more personal. And I think that's everything that I want to talk about in terms of, at a high level, what's happening in Los Angeles. It really comes down to unconstitutional ICE raids have led to these breakout protests. And instead of allowing people to exercise their fundamental First Amendment right, they are being met with a military, a National Guard that shouldn't be there, essentially. They are being met with those same forces being used against them unnecessarily. And so transitioning from everything in the news to everything on my mind, there's a conversation that has been going on for quite some time, but it's obviously come back up here recently, given the circumstances of what's been happening over the past few weeks. And the conversation really is about whether or not Black people should care. The conversation is, this is not our fight. We need to let insert those people deal with it. Immigrants, Hispanics, we should let that community who is directly affected by what's happening deal with it. And I've really been sitting with that conversation quite a bit for several reasons. The first reason is because, to be honest with you, I get it. I get it. I get the exhaustion that Black people feel, particularly Black women feel, when it comes to carrying the weight of the world. It's like, we don't get to only care about our problems. We have to care about what is seemingly other people's problems. And I'll get into why I say seemingly other people's problems in just a bit, but there is this feeling of, we're not going to fight every single battle. And I think that this is particularly a conversation now, ever since the most recent election, because the most recent election hurt. And I haven't really talked about it with anyone, honestly. After the election happened, of course, people asked me my opinion on what do I think went wrong, or, you know, how do you feel about it? And it really took some time to really process the past election. For me, this past election hurt even worse than the first election. I think the first election I was in just a pure state of shock. And in this election, it just felt so much more personal. I just felt like, how did we go through a Trump administration for 4 years and you all still come to the same conclusion that this man should be president? I think that it hurt also because, flaws and all, which I think there are legit critiques of the, Harris campaign, which she ran a campaign in 100 days. So, there's grace that has to be given there. And again, there are critiques that we can discuss and go into, but I saw a lot of myself in Kamala Harris. I mean, here you have this Black woman who is educated and has seemingly done all of the right things, have taken all of the right steps to be as prepared and as equipped and building her resume and just doing all of the things just to get right there and still be denied an opportunity that she was blatantly more equipped and prepared to take on. And why? Why? Because people are not ready for another Black president. They are not ready for a woman president. And they dang sure were not yet ready for a Black woman. People's prejudice and bias absolutely played a role in the past election. Absolutely. And again, that's not to say that there are not valid critiques of how the Democrats ran that campaign, because I do feel like there are. We have to start minimizing the pointing to the other side and, oh, they're so bad, and oh this, oh Trump, oh this, and make it more about what we are going to do to feed people. What we are going to do to make sure that people have access to healthcare. What are we going to do to make sure that everyone has access to a good education? People still need to hear what you Democrats or whatever, what you are going to do. And it should have been more of addressing those legitimate, valid concerns that people had, and a little bit less of, oh, we all don't like Trump, right? But again, it cannot be ignored how the undercurrent of this election really came down to people's prejudice, racism, sexism, bias against this woman who was beyond qualified. And as a Black woman who sees herself or saw herself and still sees herself in a lot of ways in Kamala Harris, that felt discouraging in a lot of ways. Because to me, it's like, okay, there's almost nothing that you can do. There's almost nothing that you can do because you can't change the fact that you're a Black woman, nor would I ever want to. And that's how I felt immediately after this past election. I have since evolved from that feeling and just gone back and sat with myself, sat with who I know I am as a Black woman, thought about all of the Black women before me who have excelled beyond the limitations imposed on them because of who they were racially, who they were as a woman, whatever the case, right? And so I moved past it. I moved past that, right? But it still hurt. And I think a lot of Black women, Black people felt the same way, especially when the exit polls came out and we saw that other communities of color, specifically the Hispanic, Latino community, had in the most recent election picked up more support for Trump than they did in the last one. So I'm going to read this report from the U.S. News, and it breaks down, the title of the article is How Key Demographic Groups Voted in the 2024 Election. And it breaks down how people voted across sex, or gender, how people voted, across ages and race. And so I'm going to read just quickly the breakdown, the takeaway that they have for Black voters and the takeaway that they had for Latino voters, okay? So for Black voters, it says that Harris's strongest support by far came among Black voters, where she received 83% of the vote compared to 16% for Trump. Overall, however, Harris underperformed compared to President Joe Biden during the 2020 election, where he received 91% of the vote from Black men and women compared to 8% for Trump. In particular, Trump performed better among Black men, where he received 24% versus 9% of the vote among Black women. Okay. That's a conversation. That's a conversation for another day. Okay. That's a conversation for another day. Okay. But let's get to Latino voters. So it says that while Harris beat Trump among Latino voters, the former president gained significant ground with the group from 2020. Harris received 56% of the vote compared to 42% for Trump this election. So let's stop there. Harris still received majority of the votes from Latino voters. Let's just start there, right? But it says that those numbers reflect a huge shift from the totals in 2020 when Biden received 63% of the Latino vote versus 35% for Trump. A breakdown of the vote within this demographic shows much of the shift among Latino voters toward Trump in 2024 was fueled by an increase in support among Latino men, with Harris receiving 50% of the vote compared to 47% for Trump versus 60% to 38% among Latino women. So what we're seeing is between 2020 and this past 2024 election, it appears that Trump actually gained more support. And that is true not only for Latino voters, but that was true also within the Black community. The problem is, or the conundrum, for lack of a better term, is, again, it just seems like Black people, Black women, we were all on the same page, right? We were like, we got to make sure that this man is not in the White House. And it doesn't seem like everybody was on that wavelength. There were people, coming out in the Hispanic community, in the Black community, but also in the Hispanic community, saying, "Oh, we're voting for Trump. He's going to do this and he's going to do that." And I think we have to take into account just simply misinformation, and it is what it is, right? The outcomes were the outcomes. People voted how they voted, but the reality is, in this country, Black people have literally been fighting for our lives since we got here. Okay. Since we've gotten here, we have been fighting for our lives. And it is tiring when you are fighting for your life and you're trying to communicate that, we've seen this play out before. Don't fall for the misinformation. Don't fall for the propaganda. Listen to us. We have, everyone's best interest in mind because we've been going through this more than just about anybody else, right? That's here. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration just comes from. It comes from the hurt that a lot of us are feeling after this past election. It's coming from feeling like we did our job. We were out there advocating for, people to have access to the polls. We were out there advocating, making sure that people were getting the right information, mobilizing people, just so that we would not end up in a situation like this. And yet, here we are. We can point the finger in many, many directions, but I think that is the best way to kind of sum up where that level of just, this is not our fight. We've done what we can. We did everything that we could to try to avoid the situation. People didn't listen. So now this is your situation to handle, because we tried. And I do get it. I don't hate to say it, but I do get it. And I think it is a feeling that we have to acknowledge. It's a feeling that should be respected because it's valid. And with all of that being said, we still have to acknowledge that this is our fight too. So even though we want to, pass it on to the Hispanic community, or pass it on as an immigrant issue, or pass it on as something that doesn't have to do with us, it absolutely does. And to be honest, even if there was an argument to be made that it had nothing to do with us, to me, that's just not good enough, right? Because today it's them and tomorrow it's you. And that's actually kind of what I want to get into. So acknowledging how we feel as Black people, how we perhaps feel as Black women, how I can understand being tired of having to fight the fight for everybody. The caveat is we still have to do it. And the question is why? Well, number one, have you ever heard divide and conquer? Have you ever heard of the strategy divide and conquer? Because that's exactly what happens when we put out this narrative that this is not our fight, that this is the fight of Hispanics or immigrants. That is exactly what the administration, the powers at be, the system wants you to do. That's exactly what they want you to say and exactly how they want you to feel. Because what it does is it pits marginalized communities against each other, and it minimizes the role that the system is playing in it all. And that's what this really comes down to. And by system, let's not ignore the role that disenfranchisement, voter fraud, alleged voter fraud, the electoral college. Why is that still around? You know what I'm saying? There are systemic issues at play that contributes to where we are right now. And if we minimize the role of the system just to point the finger at this other person who's also getting screwed by the system, we never get to addressing the fundamental issue. And that's exactly what they want. They want you to be distracted by, oh, it's this person's fault, or it's this person's fault, without saying, oh no, actually, it's bigger than you and it's bigger than me. That's really the fundamental issue with this is not our problem. Another thing is we can't ignore that a lot of the people who are getting deported were not allowed to participate in the voting process. So when you say, well, y'all voted for this, right? I understand the sentiment is referring to the Hispanic Latino community and saying, well, your community voted for him. Your community was out here supporting him even when we were telling y'all he wasn't looking out for you. But at the same time, you have to understand that there is a great portion of people directly impacted by these ICE raids who are not legal citizens. And we just can't forget the fundamental reasoning there. Like there's a gap there. Like these people literally were not even allowed to vote. And I'm sure, well, I can't be sure, but I'd assume that quite a percentage of those people, had they had the opportunity to vote, probably would not have. You know, I can't say for a fact, but I'd like to think so. And so that's just another thing that I think people are forgetting. Interestingly enough, people are also forgetting that there does exist Black Hispanics. We just gonna forget about them? When you say that this is not a Black issue, it completely, when you say it's not a Black issue and this is, you know, the Latino community's issue or Hispanics, how are we just gonna ignore the whole Afro-Latina community? Like, do you not understand that there does exist an identity where there are Black Hispanics? So then what? Like, how does that argument prevail, right? And I don't want to, you know, sound like I'm critiquing too much, because again, like I just said, like I understand the frustrations, but I also think it's very, very, very important that we understand that this too is our problem. What's happening in Los Angeles is very much so our problem in the state in which I reside. Very much so. And in the state where you reside. And whether you identify as an immigrant, whether you identify as Hispanic, whether you identify as Latino, whether you identify as this being your problem or not, I'm telling you, it is. Why? Well, let's think about it. If the administration can get away with completely ignoring someone's due process, constitutional right to due process in this instance, why do you think that would keep them from violating your due process rights in another instance? Would it be okay for the government to just take away your home, take away your job, take away your property, take away your life without even so much as giving you an opportunity to be heard? No. No, it wouldn't. And so even though it doesn't seem like it's applicable to you because maybe you don't identify as an immigrant, it's the bigger picture here. And the bigger picture is, like I briefly talked about in the last episode, what's happening in this administration, it won't stop with just this administration. There are people watching this go down. Another generation of mini Trumps watching and saying, "Ooh, look at that. The Constitution says this, but look at what he's getting away with. Look at what he's getting away with in Los Angeles. Look at what he's getting away with when it comes to the immigration crisis. How can I apply this across the board for other groups that I just don't like? How can I disregard the law to come after other people who I don't like, who I don't want in my communities?" This is your issue too. This is your issue too. Black people, do y'all not know that this man is literally just tried to get rid of birthright citizenship? It is a fundamental right that if you are born in this country, you are a citizen of this country, and he is challenging that. Right? This is our problem too. And I think the reason it's been so much on my mind within the past few days is because I just feel this back and forth. I get the exhaustion. I get feeling tired. I get constantly seeing people who look like me in the news being harmed and violated. And not even just people who look like me, but I get it. I get it. I feel the frustration too. I felt the hurt. We just have to make sure that we don't let ourselves get so discouraged and so jaded that we throw up our hands and forget that we're all interconnected. We can't forget that this person being harmed, this person being violated today is essentially going to impact me. If not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then next year. If not next year, then at some point down the line, the same strategy, the same way, the same tools that they're using to oppress this other community, they can and will use to oppress you. And that's been tough to reconcile. That's been tough to really think about, because these are the cards that we've been dealt. These are the cards that we've been dealt. Here we are. And now we have to deal with this for another X amount of years, right? And so, yeah, that's really been on the top of my mind within the past few days. Protests are expanding to different states now. They are in Texas, and they were already spreading out throughout California. And so I don't know, this is ongoing. This is not going to end anytime soon, I'm sure. I just hope that people remain safe. I just hope that people come to the understanding that we really have to focus on the problem, and the problem is the system. It's not each other. It really isn't each other. And so, yeah, that's how I've been feeling this week. That's how I've been feeling this week. It's really been a lot. And you know, what's so interesting is all of this happens and you still got to wake up and go to work. You still got to deal with, all of your own life things. And it's just life. It's always something. It's always a balance. It's always a juggle between all of the things. And how do y'all deal with it? How do y'all debrief? How do you all deal with the state of the world and managing that with, just your life, and also just managing the state of the world, but also staying positive, also still finding joy in life. And, it's a lot. It's a lot to consider. It's a lot to think about. I just felt like there was no way that I could shoot this podcast this week and not address the very real realities that's happening literally right outside of my doorstep. You know what I'm saying? There's just no way that I was gonna come on here and hakiki about anything without first addressing that and just putting that on the record. There's that. I really don't have anything else that I want to talk about this week. I mean, there are a lot of other things, but I'm sure you've already been watching and listening for quite some time. And I definitely want to make sure that you have enough time to go back and watch my other pods, listen to my other pods. Again, we talk about politics, but we also talk about pop culture. Last week, I was getting on Cardi B and Offset, and I was all up in their business. And I think the first week I was in, what did I talk about the first week? I'm always in somebody's business. I'm always talking about something, and I hope that you enjoy it. I hope that you continue to watch. I hope that you continue to listen and share your thoughts in the comments, either about this video, about what you want to hear from me in the future, and what you think about the state of the world, whether it's related to immigration or just anything. Share your thoughts. Feel free to let me know what you think down in the comments. Like, subscribe. I will talk to you next time, and I will talk to you soon.
It's everything.